Somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 6 adults worldwide are living with chronic kidney disease right now, and the overwhelming majority of them have no idea. Early kidney damage almost never hurts, and it almost never announces itself. It just quietly progresses. Your kidneys have an enormous amount of spare capacity built in, which is exactly what makes this so dangerous. You can lose a significant share of your kidney function and still feel completely normal, because the healthy tissue that's left simply picks up the slack. This is exactly why doctors call early chronic kidney disease a silent condition. By the time symptoms like fatigue, swelling, or changes in urination actually show up, a meaningful amount of permanent damage has often already happened, sometimes over years or even decades. One of the biggest known risk factors sits somewhere most people never think twice about: the salt shaker on the dinner table. But the real science here is genuinely more interesting and more useful than salt is bad for you. It's actually about balance, and about you specifically. Did you know the structural damage behind silent kidney decline has a specific name? Nephron scarring, the slow, permanent hardening of the kidney's tiny individual filtering units, is the physical process happening quietly beneath a completely normal-feeling day. So this is a genuinely serious, genuinely common, genuinely silent problem. And one of the most promising angles science has found for catching it earlier starts with something as ordinary as how much salt ends up on your plate, and why that hits different people so differently. Here's the detail most public health messaging leaves out. Your kidney risk isn't just about how much sodium you eat. It's about the balance between sodium and its quiet biological counterpart, potassium. And that balance turns out to matter more than either mineral alone. Sodium and potassium work like counterweights inside your body. Sodium tends to push blood pressure up and strain the kidney's filtering units, while potassium actively helps relax blood vessels and supports the kidneys in clearing sodium out. Real, opposing biological roles, not just a dietary guideline. A large Korean study following over 2,000 kidney patients for 5 years found something striking. People with a higher urinary sodium-to-potassium ratio had a meaningfully greater risk of their kidney disease actually progressing, independent of looking at either mineral alone. A separate large study found the same pattern from the other direction. People eating more potassium-rich food had a measurably lower risk of albuminuria, protein leaking into urine, one of the earliest detectable warning signs that a kidney's filtering barrier is starting to break down. This is exactly why global health guidance increasingly frames the target as a ratio, not just a ceiling. Roughly under 2 grams of sodium a day, paired with getting enough potassium from food, aiming for something close to that 1-to-1 balance rather than sodium reduction in isolation. Here's a genuinely surprising real-world finding. In several population studies, actual potassium intake sits well below recommended levels, while sodium consistently runs above target. Meaning most people's ratio problem isn't just eating too much salt, it's also eating too little of the mineral that offsets it. So the ratio, not just the raw sodium number, is where the real signal lives. But even this more complete picture still leaves one genuinely important question unanswered. Why does the exact same amount of salt seem to hit some people's kidneys so much harder than others? Here's a phenomenon doctors have documented for decades, but most people have never heard of: salt sensitivity. A real, measurable difference in how strongly an individual person's blood pressure and kidneys actually respond to the exact same amount of dietary sodium. In a salt-sensitive person, the kidneys hold on to more sodium than they should. Specialized transport proteins ramp up their activity. The nervous system's stress response gets more active, and a hormone system called the renin-angiotensin system kicks in a higher gear, all of it pushing blood pressure and kidney strain upward. This isn't evenly distributed across the population either. Older adults, people of African descent, and people who already have some kidney impairment are all documented to be more likely to be salt-sensitive, meaning the exact same diet genuinely carries different real risk depending on who's eating it. For years, though, salt sensitivity was something you could only really discover the hard way, through careful, supervised clinical testing where sodium intake gets deliberately raised and lowered while blood pressure is closely tracked. Not something anyone could know about themselves in advance. That's exactly what makes recent research so genuinely exciting. Scientists have begun identifying specific genetic variants, differences in the very genes controlling those sodium transport proteins and hormone systems, that appear to explain at least part of why some people are wired to be more salt-sensitive than others. So salt sensitivity is real, it's biologically explainable, and it's genuinely unevenly distributed, which sets up exactly the question the newest, most exciting research has finally started to answer directly. What actually happens when someone's genetic risk meets their real-world salt habits? In 2023, researchers analyzing over 465,000 people in the UK Biobank asked a deceptively simple question. Does how often someone adds salt at the table, not lab-measured intake, just a habit, actually predict who goes on to develop kidney disease? The answer was yes. A simple, self-reported habit meaningfully predicted future kidney disease risk, all on its own. But the genuinely fascinating part came 2 years later, when a separate research team asked the obvious next question. Does this effect look the same for everyone, or does it depend on your genes? That 2025 follow-up built a genetic risk score for kidney disease from over 765,000 people's genetic data, then applied it to more than 331,000 UK Biobank participants, tracking who actually developed kidney disease over an average of 8 years of follow-up. The result was genuinely striking. In people with low genetic risk for kidney disease, adding salt frequently barely moved the needle on their actual risk. But in people with high or very high genetic risk, frequent salt adding dramatically amplified their chances of developing kidney disease. In other words, the exact same daily habit, reaching for the salt shaker before even tasting your food, carries a genuinely different real-world consequence depending on genetic factors completely invisible to the naked eye, something no amount of willpower alone could reveal on its own. This is precisely the kind of finding scientists mean when they talk about gene-environment interaction, not genetics alone determining your fate, and not lifestyle alone either, but the two multiplying each other's effect in ways neither factor reveals when studied by itself. For the first time, there's real, published, large-scale evidence that personalized salt guidance isn't just a marketing phrase. Some people genuinely need to worry about their salt habits far more urgently than others, and science can now partly explain why. Here's a genuine plot twist worth knowing, and it's one that surprises a lot of people. For someone who already has chronic kidney disease, cutting sodium too aggressively isn't automatically the safest move. The actual evidence behind blanket salt restriction is more uncertain than most advice suggests. One of the major international kidney guidelines, KDIGO, does recommend limiting sodium, but grades that specific recommendation as low-certainty evidence, an honest acknowledgement that the science supporting strict, one-size-fits-all salt restriction in kidney disease isn't as solid as many public health messages imply. Swapping in potassium-based salt substitutes, a popular workaround for cutting sodium, carries its own genuine risks specifically for people with reduced kidney function. Those kidneys often can't clear extra potassium efficiently, and too much potassium in the blood can become a dangerous problem in its own right. Quick pause. If this breakdown is helping you, take a second to hit like and subscribe. It genuinely takes a lot of effort to make videos like this, and your support keeps them coming. This exact concern is serious enough that researchers are currently running dedicated clinical trials specifically testing which salt substitutes are actually safe for people with kidney disease, a genuinely active, unresolved research question, not a settled matter with an obvious universal answer. This is exactly the nuanced blanket advice misses. The right sodium and potassium target genuinely depends on your existing kidney function, your blood pressure, your medications, and now, increasingly, your genetic risk profile, not a single universal number that applies identically to every single person. So the honest picture is more interesting than either salt is simply bad or salt doesn't matter. It's genuinely individual, genuinely dependent on context, and exactly the kind of complexity that finally explains why the word personalized belongs in this conversation at all. Given everything covered so far, it's worth being honest about a genuinely important distinction. Personalized salt guidance today does not mean a doctor's office running a genetic test and handing you a custom sodium number on the spot. That specific tool doesn't exist yet in mainstream medical practice. What personalized genuinely means in current practice is closer to risk stratification, knowing your own risk factors, family history of kidney disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, ethnicity-linked salt sensitivity, existing kidney function, and adjusting how seriously you take sodium and potassium balance accordingly. The genetic research covered earlier is genuinely exciting precisely because of where it's heading, not because it's already sitting in a doctor's toolkit. Polygenic risk scores like the one used in that 2025 study remain research tools today, not commercially validated clinical tests you can currently order. That distinction matters because it separates real, actionable advice from anything overselling where the science currently stands. Today's honest personalization is about using known risk factors wisely, while tomorrow's genuinely promising direction is about genetics eventually sharpening that picture even further. A simple blood and urine test already available at essentially any clinic, checking kidney function and, when relevant, a spot urine sodium-to-potassium measurement, remains the actual practical tool doing real work today, not a futuristic gadget still years from your local pharmacy. So the promise is real, the trajectory is genuinely exciting, and the honest state of the science today is a meaningful, useful middle ground. Nowhere near science fiction, but also genuinely further along than just eat less salt ever was. Pulling every thread of this story together into something genuinely useful. Here's what the actual evidence supports doing today, without waiting for a genetic test that doesn't exist yet or a monitoring gadget that isn't on the market. Start with knowing your own risk factors honestly. A family history of kidney disease or high blood pressure, your ethnicity, your age, and any existing diagnosis of diabetes or hypertension all genuinely shift how seriously you should personally weigh your sodium and potassium habits. Second, shift your thinking from pure restriction to genuine balance. Adding potassium-rich foods like leafy greens, bananas, beans, and potatoes matters just as much as trimming excess sodium. This is a two-sided ratio problem, not a one-sided cutting exercise. Third, and genuinely underused, a basic kidney function blood test, often called eGFR, is inexpensive, quick, and already part of most routine checkups. Yet it's frequently skipped by people who feel completely fine and see no reason to ask for it specifically. Fourth, blood pressure remains one of the clearest, most accessible real-world signals connecting salt sensitivity to kidney strain. A home blood pressure cuff, checked periodically over weeks, can reveal patterns a single doctor's office reading, taken once, genuinely never could. If you already know you fall into a higher risk group, family history, existing hypertension, diabetes, or you're simply getting older, these 4 steps genuinely deserve more urgency than they would for someone with none of those factors present. None of this requires giving up flavor entirely. Either herbs, spices, citrus, vinegar, and aromatics like garlic and onion can replace a meaningful share of a dish's saltiness without adding sodium at all, a genuinely underused trick most people never fully explore. None of these 4 steps require a prescription, a specialist referral, or a single piece of technology that doesn't already exist, which is exactly the point. Real, evidence-backed personalization is already more accessible than most people realize. For genuinely simple, evidence-backed steps, none of them futuristic, all of them available right now. Go a real distance toward catching silent kidney decline before it ever becomes symptomatic decline. So where does this genuinely go from here? The honest trajectory of this research points toward a future where your own genetic risk score could realistically sit alongside your blood pressure and family history as one more data point your doctor actually uses. Researchers are already working on the next logical step, validating these genetic risk scores in larger, more diverse populations beyond the mostly European ancestry data used in the 2025 study. Since genetic risk factors don't always translate cleanly across different ancestral backgrounds. Given how common silent kidney disease already is, and how cheap genetic sequencing has become compared to just a decade ago, this isn't a decades-away fantasy. Informed observers reasonably expect some version of genetics-informed risk stratification within clinical reach well within the coming years. In the meantime, the field is also quietly refining the more mundane, already available tools. Better spot urine tests, clearer sodium-to-potassium ratio targets, and more precise guidance for people who already have reduced kidney function, where blanket advice has always fit worst. It's worth remembering the actual scale of what's at stake one more time. With as many as 1 in 6 adults affected worldwide, even a modest improvement in how early silent kidney decline gets caught would meaningfully change outcomes for an enormous number of people. This story is also a genuinely good example of how real science actually works in practice. Not a single dramatic breakthrough, but small pieces, a ratio here, a genetic score there, a habit study connecting them, gradually assembling into something clinically useful. So the next time you reach for the salt shaker, there's now a genuinely accurate, genuinely interesting story behind that ordinary moment. One connecting your specific biology, decades of kidney research, and some of the most current science being published anywhere in medicine right now. The takeaway was never panic about salt. It was always know your own picture. And that picture just became meaningfully clearer than it's ever been before, backed by real, current, published research rather than guesswork. A silent disease, a surprisingly personal biological story, and a genuinely exciting research frontier, all hiding in something as ordinary as a salt shaker. Knowing that story is now, quite literally, part of protecting your own kidneys. Here are the key references and sources for this video. Thanks so much for watching. If this helped, like the video and subscribe for more clear, simple explainers, and I'll see you in the next one.